Long before the names samurai and ninja became symbols recognized across the world. Long before stories transformed them into larger-than-life figures. Japan was a land still defining its identity. Mountains divided regions. Rivers isolated communities. Thick forests covered much of the countryside. Communication was slow. Travel was dangerous. Local power often mattered far more than distant authority. If we want to understand the true relationship between samurai and ninja, we have to leave behind the familiar legends. We have to forget the black masks, the impossible sword fights, the magical disappearances, the dramatic duels that dominate movies and television. The real history is more complicated. It is also far more interesting. These were not simply two rival groups locked in endless conflict. They lived in the same country. They often served the same rulers. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they opposed one another. Sometimes the distinction between them became surprisingly difficult to define. Their stories unfolded during centuries when Japan experienced political upheaval, civil war, religious conflict, economic transformation, technological change, and the slow construction of one of history's most disciplined military societies. Understanding these warriors means understanding the world that created them. The Japan of more than 1,000 years ago was very different from the nation we know today. Power officially belonged to the emperor. The imperial court in Kyoto represented legitimacy. Ancient traditions surrounded the throne. Ceremonies were performed with extraordinary precision. Poetry flourished. Elegant clothing reflected status. Music, literature, painting, calligraphy. These were the accomplishments admired by the highest ranks of society. Yet beyond the capital, reality looked very different. The authority of the imperial court weakened the farther one traveled from Kyoto. Mountain valleys, coastal plains, remote forests, farming village. These places often depended upon local leaders rather than imperial officials. Communication across the islands remained slow. Roads could become impassable. Rivers flooded. Winter snow isolated entire communities. In many regions, local disputes had to be solved without waiting for orders from the capital. As wealthy estates expanded across the countryside, their owners faced new challenges. Fields had to be protected. Harvests had to be defended. Bandits threatened trade routes. Neighboring landowners competed over borders. Rivers, forests, and taxes. The court possessed prestige. It did not always possess practical control. Out of these changing conditions, a new kind of professional fighter gradually emerged. These men were not originally romantic heroes. They were practical solutions to practical problems. Their duty was protection. They guarded estates, escorted important individuals, collected taxes, enforced agreements, defended property. Over generations, these armed retainers became increasingly important. Their skills made them valuable. Their loyalty made them powerful. Their families passed military knowledge from father to son. Eventually, they formed a distinct social identity. The word that later became famous around the world. Samurai, derived from a verb meaning to serve. That original meaning matters. The earliest samurai were not independent warriors searching for personal glory. They served. Their honor came through loyalty. Their identity depended upon their relationship with those above them. As political struggles intensified across Japan, these military households expanded. Children born into such families began learning martial skills almost as soon as they could walk. Discipline became part of everyday life. Strength mattered, but so did patience, observation, endurance, respect for authority. Military skill developed over many years rather than appearing overnight. Contrary to modern imagination, the sword was not always the center of samurai warfare. The earliest warriors earned much of their reputation through mounted archery. Horse and bow formed a devastating combination. A skilled rider could strike enemies before they ever came close enough for swords to matter. Training with a long Japanese bow demanded incredible strength. The weapon itself looked unusual. Its grip sat below the center rather than directly in the middle. This asymmetrical design allowed effective shooting from horseback. Mastering it required years of practice. Accuracy alone was not enough. The rider had to control the horse, judge distance, read terrain, time every movement. Battles often unfolded across open ground where mounted archers searched for opportunities before closing into closer combat. Only after arrows had been exchanged did swords become increasingly important. Even then, many warriors relied heavily upon spears. Polearms reached farther, required less space, and often proved more practical on crowded battlefields. The famous curved katana that dominates popular culture would eventually become one of Japan's most recognizable symbols. But history developed gradually. Military equipment constantly evolved. Armor changed. Weapons changed. Battlefield tactics changed. Nothing remained fixed forever. The same was true of the warriors themselves. As military families accumulated influence, some rose above the aristocrats who had once commanded them. The balance of power slowly shifted. Several powerful clans competed for influence over the imperial government. Political alliances formed, collapsed, reformed. Old rivalries deepened. Military conflict became increasingly common. One struggle in particular reshaped Japanese history forever. During the late 12th century, rival clans fought for supremacy in a conflict remembered today as the Genpei War. It lasted several years. Entire regions became battlefields. Powerful families committed enormous resources to victory. When the conflict finally ended, the victorious Minamoto clan established a military government led by a shogun. The emperor remained an essential figure, but practical authority increasingly rested in military hands. For the first time, Japan entered an age in which professional warriors stood at the center of national politics. This transformation influenced every level of society. Military service became one of the highest ambitions available to noble families. Land grants rewarded loyal retainers. Castles expanded. Regional leaders strengthened their private forces. Generations grew up expecting conflict. Peace became temporary rather than permanent. During these centuries, ideas about honorable conduct also developed. Modern discussions often describe a single ancient code called Bushido. Reality was more gradual. There is no universally accepted handbook followed by every warrior across medieval Japan. Instead, customs evolved over time. Different families emphasized different virtues. Different regions developed their own traditions. Only centuries later would writers attempt to organize these ideas into formal philosophical works. Even so, several values appeared repeatedly. Loyalty ranked among the highest. A warrior's reputation depended upon faithful service. Breaking trust could stain an entire family for generations. Courage also mattered, not reckless bravery. but disciplined resolve. Fear existed. Every soldier experienced it. Honor came from continuing despite fear, rather than pretending fear never existed. Self-control became equally important. Anger clouded judgment. Impulsive decisions endangered companions. Successful commanders understood that victory depended as much upon discipline as raw aggression. Education also held surprising importance. Popular culture often portrays samurai as little more than sword fighters. Historical reality paints a richer picture. Many members of the warrior elite studied literature, history, poetry, calligraphy, religious philosophy, administrative law. Military leadership required more than physical strength. A provincial governor needed to manage taxes, resolve disputes, correspond with allies, interpret official documents, negotiate marriages, maintain alliances, led soldiers. The ideal warrior balanced intellect with martial ability. This balance became one of the defining characteristics of samurai culture. Religion shaped this world as well. Shinto traditions remained deeply rooted across Japan. Sacred shrines honored local spirits. Seasonal rituals connected communities to the natural world. Buddhism spread through many regions. Its different schools influenced politics, education, art, and military thinking. Among warriors, Zen Buddhism eventually gained particular significance. Meditation encouraged calmness, concentration, acceptance of uncertainty. These ideas appealed to men whose lives often depended upon split-second decisions. Facing death became part of military existence, not because warriors sought death, but because they accepted its possibility. This distinction matters. Historical samurai generally valued survival. Experienced commanders understood that living veterans remained more useful than dead heroes. Yet they also recognized that hesitation born from overwhelming fear could destroy armies. Mental preparation, therefore, became just as valuable as physical preparation. Armor reflected both practical necessity and artistic expression. Unlike the heavy steel plate armor associated with medieval Europe, Japanese armor used many smaller plates connected by silk or leather cords. The result created flexibility while still offering protection. Lacquer helped resist moisture. Bright colors identified families. Helmets often displayed elaborate decorations. Some featured antlers. Others displayed crescents, horns, or distinctive crests. These designs served psychological purposes as much as aesthetic ones. A commander needed to be recognized across chaotic battlefields. Appearance communicated authority, identity, and confidence. Family remained the foundation beneath everything. Military traditions passed through generations. Children inherited responsibilities alongside privileges. Marriage often strengthened political alliances rather than romantic relationships. Every household understood that personal choices could influence regional stability. Women within warrior families also played important roles, although fewer fought on battlefields than men. Historical evidence shows that some received weapons training, especially with the naginata, a long pole weapon particularly suited to defending homes and fortified residences. When armies marched away, castles and estates still require protection. Responsibility extended to every capable member of the household. Across these centuries, the warrior class continued growing stronger. Military leaders accumulated wealth, influence, and independence. The imperial court remained culturally prestigious, but practical authority increasingly belonged to armed elites whose fortunes depended upon organization, training, discipline, and force. Few people living at that time could have imagined how dramatically Japan would continue changing, or that elsewhere, far from the centers of political power, in isolated mountain regions where survival demanded entirely different skills, another military tradition was slowly taking shape, one that would eventually become surrounded by mystery unlike almost any other in world history. While the military elite strengthened their influence across much of Japan, life unfolded very differently in the rugged mountains of central Honshu. The provinces that would later become most closely associated with the ninja were not rich lands. They were not centers of political power. They were not places where ambitious nobles expected to build magnificent courts. Instead, they were regions of steep slopes, thick forests, narrow valleys, hidden trails, and scattered farming communities that depended upon resilience more than wealth. Among these regions, two names would eventually become legendary: Ika and Koka. Today they are often spoken of almost as mythical places. In reality, they were ordinary provinces inhabited by ordinary people facing difficult circumstances. Their fields were smaller than those found in fertile plains. Travel remained challenging. Mountain passes could become impassable during winter. Communities learned to rely upon themselves because outside help often arrived too late. Geography shaped culture. It always has. People living in isolated terrain developed different habits than those living near great capitals. They memorized every stream, every hidden path, every ridge, every cave, every shortcut through dense woodland. Knowledge of the landscape became as valuable as weapons. An outsider might see only a forest. A local resident saw countless routes invisible to unfamiliar eyes. This intimate understanding of terrain later became one of the greatest advantages possessed by the people outsiders would call ninja. The historical word most commonly used during the medieval period was not actually ninja. It was shinobi. The term carried meanings connected with stealth, concealment, moving unnoticed, remaining unseen until the proper moment. Only centuries later did the pronunciation ninja become widely popular. This difference may seem minor, yet it reminds us that history rarely uses exactly the same language as modern storytelling. The earliest shinobi were not members of a mysterious secret society, nor were they supernatural assassins trained in hidden temples. They emerged gradually from practical necessity. Mountain communities often lacked the resources to field large conventional armies. If powerful neighbors threatened them, meeting those enemies head-on would have been disastrous. They needed different solutions. Surprise, mobility, observation, patience, knowledge. These became their greatest weapons, rather than overwhelming opponents through numbers. They sought advantages before fighting even began. Where would an enemy march? How many soldiers were approaching? How much food did they carry? Which mountain paths remained unguarded? Which bridges could be destroyed? Which streams supplied drinking water? Information could determine victory long before swords crossed. This practical approach formed the heart of historical shinobi activity. Modern fiction often emphasizes assassination above everything else. Historical evidence suggests something different. Gathering intelligence occupied far more time than killing. A lord preparing for war desperately wanted reliable information. How many defenders occupied a castle? Were supplies running low? Had reinforcements already arrived? Were rival commanders arguing among themselves? Had disease spread through enemy camps? Could local villagers be persuaded to support one side instead of another? Every answer reduced uncertainty. Every piece of reliable intelligence increased strategic advantage. The greatest shinobi were often those who returned without ever drawing a weapon. That required remarkable discipline. Success depended upon remaining unnoticed. Recognition meant failure. Unlike battlefield warriors whose achievements might earn public praise, a successful infiltration usually left no evidence behind. No songs celebrated it. No witnesses admired it. Silence became the greatest compliment. Training reflected these unusual demands. Historical manuals written centuries later describe education extending far beyond combat. Children growing up within families connected to shinobi traditions learned practical skills from an early age. They climbed trees not merely for exercise, but to move confidently through difficult environments. They crossed rivers in every season. They studied weather patterns. They learned which plants could heal injuries, which plants should never be eaten, how smoke traveled through valleys, how moonlight changed visibility, how different footwear sounded upon wood, stone, gravel, or wet earth. These lessons accumulated slowly. No single technique created mastery. Instead, competence emerged from thousands of small observations remembered over many years. Disguise also played an important role. Here again, reality differs from popular imagination. Historical shinobi did not usually wear black clothing while sneaking through enemy territory. That famous image owes much to later theater traditions. Actors portraying invisible stage assistants dressed entirely in black. Audiences understood the convention. Eventually, playwrights used the same costume for ninja characters meant to appear unseen. The image became iconic. History followed a different path. A person attempting to travel unnoticed benefited from looking ordinary. Merchants wore merchant clothing. Pilgrims dressed as pilgrims. Farmers resembled farmers. Traveling monks carried the appearance expected of religious wanderers. The ideal disguise attracted no attention. If everyone remembered seeing you, the disguise had failed. Learning to imitate ordinary behavior demanded careful observation. A convincing merchant knew market prices. A convincing monk understood religious customs. A convincing laborer recognized farming terminology. Small mistakes exposed imposters. Therefore, successful shinobi accumulated broad practical knowledge. Some later manuals even encouraged studying regional accents. Speech could reveal an outsider faster than clothing. The ability to blend into conversations without attracting suspicion represented a remarkable skill. Physical conditioning remained important. Travel often covered great distances across difficult landscapes. Speed mattered. Endurance mattered even more. A messenger exhausted after one night accomplished little. Historical accounts describe shinobi capable of moving quickly across mountains where larger military forces struggled to advance. Again, this ability came less from superhuman athleticism than from intimate familiarity with terrain. Knowing the right path often mattered more than running faster. Water presented another challenge. Japan's landscape contains countless rivers, streams, marshes, and coastlines. Crossing them quietly required practice. Historical manuals discuss flotation devices made from ordinary materials. Simple techniques often replace dramatic inventions. Ressources funèbres consistent outweg de spectacle. One fascinating aspect of shinobi education involves psychology. Centuries before the term existed, these practitioners recognized that understanding people could be more powerful than defeating them physically. Who liked to boast, who drank too much, who disliked their commander, who worried constantly, who accepted flattery, who trusted strangers too easily. Every human weakness represented potential opportunity. Observation became almost a science. Patience again proved essential. Instead of forcing situations, experienced operatives often waited. People eventually revealed themselves. Fear, greed, pride, jealousy, ambition, loneliness, all could influence decisions. Understanding these emotions allowed careful manipulation without violence. This approach distinguished shinobi from many conventional warriors. Victory through information remained preferable to victory through bloodshed whenever possible. That did not mean historical shinobi avoided combat entirely. Far from it. Danger accompanied nearly every mission. Capture often meant torture, execution, or worse. The risks were enormous. For precisely that reason, avoiding unnecessary confrontation became common sense. Weapons certainly existed, but they occupied a different place than modern mythology suggests. The straight-bladed sword often associated with ninja remains debated among historians. Archaeological evidence is limited. Many scholars believe historical shinobi frequently carried ordinary weapons already common in Japan. Using familiar equipment drew less attention. Shuriken also deserve careful consideration. Popular culture often portrays them as deadly throwing stars capable of incredible accuracy. Historical manuals describe more practical uses: creating distraction, slowing pursuit, breaking concentration, forcing opponents to hesitate. Even a brief moment of confusion might provide enough time to escape. Escape usually mattered more than defeating an opponent. Other specialized tools appear throughout surviving documents. Small climbing devices, portable ladder, hooks, ropes, compact saws, simple equipment built for specific problems. Many could be hidden inside ordinary baggage. Again, practicality defined the profession. Every object carried additional weight. Only useful items justified inclusion. The relationship between shinobi communities and surrounding political authorities remained complicated. Unlike hereditary samurai, serving one lord across generations, many specialists in covert operations accepted assignments from different employers at different times. Loyalty certainly existed, but contracts often reflected immediate political realities. Some communities developed reputations for providing skilled intelligence services. Powerful regional rulers noticed. Demand increased. Reputation spread. Not every person from IGA or Koka became a shinobi. Most remained farmers, craftsmen, laborers. Families needed food more often than secret missions. Yet certain lineages preserved specialized knowledge across generations. These traditions gradually became associated with entire regions. Religion influenced these mountain communities in distinctive ways as well. Shinto beliefs remained deeply rooted. Buddhist practices spread widely. Mountain ascetics, known as Yamabushi, traveled through remote areas performing rigorous spiritual disciplines. These practitioners pursued endurance, meditation, isolation, and mastery over physical hardship. Some historical evidence suggests interaction between Yamabushi traditions and later shinobi practices. Exactly how extensive that influence became remains debated. Historians continue examining the available evidence carefully. Separating documented history from later legend requires caution. One reason uncertainty persists lies in the nature of the profession itself. People engaged in covert operations rarely left detailed autobiographies. Successful missions remained secret. Records often disappeared. Documents burned during wars, or remained hidden within private families. As a result, much of what survives comes from military reports, government records, later instructional manuals, and writings produced after the great age of civil conflict had already ended. This incomplete evidence explains why certainty remains difficult. Modern audiences sometimes expect every historical question to possess a clear answer. The medieval world rarely provides such certainty. Instead, historians compare sources, study archaeology, analyze handwriting, examine local traditions, and gradually reconstruct the most likely picture. That picture reveals people who were neither magical nor ordinary in the simplistic sense. They were highly trained specialists responding to the demands of an unstable age. Their skills developed because warfare demanded them. Their reputation expanded because success often remained invisible. Ironically, the less anyone noticed their work, the better they had performed it. By the 15th century, Japan entered one of the most turbulent eras in its history. Central authority weakened dramatically. Old political structures fractured. Powerful regional lords prepared for conflict on an unprecedented scale. The coming generations would witness almost continuous warfare. For ambitious commanders, reliable intelligence became priceless. For mountain communities known for stealth and observation, opportunity arrived alongside danger. The age that would define both the samurai and the shinobi had begun, and neither tradition would remain unchanged by what followed. For generations, tensions have been building beneath the surface of Japanese society. Powerful families competed for influence. Military governors accumulated authority that once belonged to the central government. Regional disputes became increasingly difficult to control. The institutions that had held the country together slowly weakened. Then, in the second half of the 15th century, everything changed. In the year 1467, a conflict broke out in Kyoto that historians now call the Yunnan War. At first, it appeared to be another political dispute over succession. Japan had experienced struggles for power before. Few could have predicted that this conflict would ignite more than a century of instability. The fighting spread through the capital. Neighborhoods that had once echoed with music, poetry, and court ceremonies became battlefields. Great residences burned. Temples were destroyed. Markets disappeared beneath smoke. Thousands of ordinary people fled the city, searching for safety. When the war finally ended, peace did not return. Instead, central authority had collapsed. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name. The emperor still occupied the throne, but neither possessed enough military strength to control the country. Across Japan, ambitious regional lords began acting independently. Historians remember this period as the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. It lasted for roughly 150 years. During those generations, alliances formed and collapsed with astonishing speed. Castles rose across the landscape. Armies marched almost every year. Entire provinces changed hands repeatedly. For ordinary farmers, uncertainty became a constant companion. A village might owe taxes to one lord in spring, another by autumn. A neighboring castle might surrender peacefully, or it might resist until every building inside had burned. Life depended upon forces beyond the control of most people. For warriors, however, this age created opportunity unlike anything Japan had seen before. The demand for trained soldiers exploded. Military leaders searched constantly for capable fighters. The old aristocratic order weakened. Skill began to matter more than noble ancestry. Although family background remained important, talent could sometimes overcome humble origins. One of the most remarkable aspects of this era was its unpredictability. Men born with little status occasionally rose to command armies. Powerful families vanished after a single disastrous campaign. Victory belonged not simply to the strongest, but often to the most adaptable. The battlefield itself also changed. Earlier generations had celebrated mounted warriors engaging in individual combat. Now warfare became larger, more organized, more disciplined. Armies numbered in the tens of thousands. Infantry played an increasingly important role. Commanders needed logistics, food supplies, engineers, messengers, scouts, medical support, construction crews. The image of a lone heroic warrior deciding the outcome of battle became less realistic with every passing decade. Victory increasingly belonged to those who could organize entire military systems. Castles reflected this transformation. Earlier fortifications had often been relatively modest. Now enormous strongholds dominated strategic positions. High stone walls appeared. Complex networks of gates forced attackers into narrow approaches. Watchtowers overlooked surrounding countryside. Moats deepened. Defensive planning became more sophisticated than ever before. These castles served many purposes. They protected military leaders, stored food, housed soldiers, collected taxes, demonstrated political authority, controlled nearby roads. Whoever controlled a castle often controlled the surrounding province. Capturing one through direct assault could require enormous sacrifice. This reality increased the value of intelligence. Before risking thousands of lives against fortified walls, commanders wanted information. How many defenders remained inside? How much food did they possess? Which gates received the least attention? Were supplies stored? Which officers argued among themselves? Could someone inside be persuaded to cooperate? Every answer might save hundreds of soldiers. This growing need transformed the importance of shinobi. Regional lords increasingly hired specialists capable of entering hostile territory unnoticed. Sometimes these individuals counted troops. Sometimes they measured walls. Sometimes they observed construction projects. Sometimes they listened to conversations in taverns or markets. Sometimes they simply confirmed whether rumors proved true. Reliable information became one of the most valuable resources in Japan. False information proved equally dangerous. An army marching toward an enemy believed to possess 5,000 soldiers might discover 20,000 waiting instead. Entire campaigns collapsed because commanders trusted inaccurate reports. This made experienced intelligence gatherers indispensable. The mountain communities of Aegea and Koka gained growing reputations for producing such specialists. Word spread. Powerful daimyos sought their assistance. The term daimyo referred to the great territorial lords whose domains dominated regional politics. Some inherited substantial lands. Others seized opportunity during the chaos. Every one of them understood the importance of knowing more than their rivals. Yet the relationship between samurai and shinobi remained surprisingly practical. Popular culture often portrays mutual hatred. Historical evidence suggests something much less dramatic. A military commander concerned primarily with survival cared little whether valuable information arrived through a mounted scout or a covert operative. Results mattered. If a mission succeeded, the method often became secondary. Many samurai officers regularly employed shinobi. Some even maintained permanent groups of intelligence specialists. The distinction between warrior and spy was sometimes less rigid than modern audiences imagine. Certain samurai personally carried out reconnaissance. Some shinobi fought openly when circumstances required. Reality refused to fit simple categories. Military innovation accelerated throughout the Sengoku period. Spears became longer. Infantry formations grew more disciplined. Signal systems improved. Flags identified different units across smoky battlefields. Drums and conch shells transmitted commands over long distances. Engineers developed increasingly sophisticated siege techniques. Every campaign encouraged further experimentation. Then another revolutionary change arrived from overseas. In the year 1543, Portuguese traders reached Japan. Among the goods they introduced was a weapon unlike anything previously known there. The matchlock firearm, known in Japan as the tanegashima. At first, these guns appeared as curious foreign devices. Expensive, slow to load, difficult to manufacture. Some traditional warriors dismissed them. Others immediately recognized their potential. Japanese craftsmen proved remarkably skilled at copying imported technology. Within a surprisingly short period, workshops across the country produced thousands of firearms. Military leaders quickly realized that disciplined formations of soldiers armed with guns could transform warfare. Unlike mastering the bow, which required years of practice, basic firearm training demanded far less time. This did not eliminate the importance of skilled warriors, but it changed battlefield calculations forever. Armies adapted, castles adapted, armor adapted, strategy adapted. The age of constant military innovation had arrived. For shinobi, firearms created both challenges and opportunities. Moving across open ground became more dangerous. A hidden marksman could threaten infiltrators from considerable distance. At the same time, explosives gained new military significance. Gunpowder served purposes beyond firearms. It could damage gates, destroy bridges, create confusion, start fires. Psychological shock often proved almost as valuable as physical destruction. Historical records describe covert missions involving sabotage against supplies rather than dramatic assassination attempts. Destroying stored food, damaging ammunition, burning transport wagons. These actions could weaken an army before battle even began. Again, the goal remained practical military advantage, not theatrical spectacle. Communication also became a battlefield in its own right. Messengers carried orders across dangerous territory. Interception could alter entire campaigns. A delayed letter, a forged document, a rumor whispered into the right ears. These subtle actions sometimes influenced events as much as direct combat. Experienced commanders therefore devoted enormous effort to protecting information. They developed coded messages, trusted couriers, secret meeting places, multiple confirmation systems. Every side sought to reduce uncertainty. No commander embraced military innovation more aggressively than one extraordinary leader whose name would forever reshape Japanese history. Oda Nobunaga, born into a relatively modest branch of a warrior family. He inherited neither overwhelming wealth nor uncontested authority. Many contemporaries underestimated him. Some considered him reckless. Others believed him eccentric. His clothing often ignored conventional expectations. His behavior puzzled more traditional nobles. Behind these unconventional habits, however, stood a mind capable of seeing possibilities others overlooked. Nobunaga valued effectiveness above tradition. If older customs hindered victory, he discarded them. If new technology improved military performance, he adopted it. His willingness to embrace firearms distinguished him from many rivals. Instead of treating guns as novelties, he organized disciplined units capable of coordinated volleys, combined with careful planning. These tactics proved devastating. His rise began gradually. Small victories strengthened his reputation. Successful alliances expanded his influence. Defeated enemies surrendered territory. Those who resisted too stubbornly often faced destruction. By the 1560s, Nobunaga had become one of Japan's most formidable military leaders. His ambitions extended far beyond regional dominance. He envisioned unifying the country itself. Such an objective required overcoming countless rivals, powerful clans, independent religious organizations, fortified castles, mountain strongholds. Every obstacle demanded a different solution. Some opponents submitted through negotiation. Others required years of campaigning. Still others resisted until the very end. Among the independent regions, attracting Nobunaga's attention stood Aegean. Unlike many neighboring territories, Aegean maintained unusual political traditions. Rather than existing under the firm control of one dominant daimyo, local families exercised considerable influence. Their defensive skills, knowledge of the mountains, and experience with irregular warfare had preserved their autonomy through decades of conflict. For Nobunaga, such independence represented more than a political inconvenience. It challenged the unified order he sought to create. He believed Japan required centralized authority. Independent military communities stood in the way of that vision. The stage slowly became set for one of the most famous confrontations in the history of the shinobi. It would not resemble the dramatic duels of modern fiction. Instead, it would demonstrate the overwhelming power of organized armies against even the most skilled defenders. And it would change the future of Aegean forever. By the middle of the 16th century, Japan had become a nation where survival depended on preparation. Every ambitious lord understood that today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy. A marriage arranged to secure peace might collapse within a single season. A trusted retainer might change sides if offered greater rewards elsewhere. Victory belonged not only to those who fought well, it belonged to those who anticipated change before everyone else. Among all the military leaders of the Sengoku period, few understood this better than Oda Nobunaga. His campaigns were not simply a series of battles. They represented a complete transformation in the way war could be fought, where many commanders respected tradition because it had served previous generations. Nobunaga constantly asked a different question. Does it work? If the answer was yes, he adopted the method. If the answer was no, he abandoned it without hesitation. That attitude made him both admired and feared. His armies became increasingly disciplined. He invested heavily in logistics. Roads mattered. Supply wagons mattered. Communication mattered. Many earlier campaigns had collapsed because armies ran out of food long before they ran out of courage. Nobunaga intended to avoid such mistakes. He understood that an army marched not only on weapons, but on rice, water, pack animals, blacksmiths, carpenters, doctors, messengers. Every successful campaign depended upon thousands of people whose names never appeared in heroic stories. He also understood something equally important: psychology. An enemy defeated in spirit often became easier to defeat on the battlefield. When resistance appeared hopeless, some castles surrendered before the first assault began. That saved time, saved supplies, and allowed his armies to continue advancing. Reputation became another weapon. Stories of his victories spread across Japan. So did stories of his ruthlessness. Modern historians continue debating whether some of those stories were exaggerated. What cannot be disputed is that many contemporaries believe them. Fear alone sometimes opened gates that armies otherwise would have needed months to breach. Yet despite all his military brilliance, Nobunaga still faced regions that refused to submit. One of those regions lay among the mountains of Aegean. To understand why Aegean remained independent for so long, we must remember its geography. Large invading armies struggled there. Narrow valleys restricted movement. Dense forests limited visibility. Steep slopes exhausted soldiers unfamiliar with the terrain. The people who lived there knew every trail, every ridge, every hidden approach. Local knowledge became a force multiplier. Small defensive groups could slow much larger armies. For decades, this had helped preserve Aegean's autonomy. The communities of the province also possessed unusual political traditions. Rather than accepting rule from a single dominant warlord, local families cooperated in loose alliances. They managed their affairs collectively to a greater extent than many neighboring provinces. This structure made outside domination difficult. Capturing one stronghold did not necessarily bring the others under control. Resistance could continue from multiple directions. To ambitious unifiers like Nobunaga, such independence represented unfinished business. Initially, the confrontation did not begin with Nobunaga himself. Instead, it involved his son, Oda Nobukochu, eager to demonstrate his own military ability. Nobukatsu launched an invasion into Aegean during the late 1570s. The campaign quickly revealed how dangerous overconfidence could become. The invading force expected a relatively straightforward operation. Instead, the defenders exploited every advantage available. Mountain paths became traps. Ambushes struck unexpectedly. Movement slowed. Communication suffered. Confusion spread. Historical sources differ on many details, as often happens with 16th century warfare, but they broadly agree on one conclusion. The invasion failed. The attacking army suffered severe losses. For the people of Aegean, the victory demonstrated that their methods still worked. For Nobunaga, It became a personal embarrassment. His family's prestige had suffered. The province had openly resisted his authority. That resistance would not be ignored. 2 years later, the response came, and it came on a scale unlike anything IGA had ever faced. In 1581, Nobunaga assembled an enormous force. Modern estimates vary, because historical records rarely agree exactly. But historians generally believe tens of thousands of soldiers participated, compared with the defenders. The numerical difference was overwhelming. This was no limited expedition. It was a coordinated military operation designed to eliminate organized resistance completely. The invasion approached from multiple directions. Instead of relying upon a single advancing column, Nobunaga's commanders entered through different mountain passes simultaneously. This strategy reduced the defenders' ability to concentrate their forces. It also limited escape routes. For the communities of IGA, the familiar mountains that had long provided security suddenly became increasingly difficult to defend. The fighting was fierce. Local defenders used every advantage available. They launched surprise attacks. They attempted to disrupt advancing columns. Knowledge of the terrain still allowed them to inflict casualties. But this time the numbers worked against them. The invading army possessed greater manpower, greater resources, more firearms, more supplies. Losses that might cripple a smaller force could be replaced. Gradually, village after village fell. Fortifications burned. Storehouses disappeared in flames. Families fled deeper into the mountains whenever escape remained possible. Some historical accounts describe entire settlements destroyed during the campaign. Others emphasize that many inhabitants managed to escape before the invaders arrived. The exact scale remains debated. What is beyond serious dispute is the outcome. Organized resistance collapsed. The political independence of IGA effectively ended. For later generations, this event acquired almost legendary status. Popular culture often portrays it as the destruction of all ninja. Reality proved more complicated. The traditions associated with IGA did not vanish overnight. People survived. Families relocated. Knowledge traveled with them. Some entered the service of powerful daimyo elsewhere. Others blended into ordinary communities. Skills developed over generations cannot be erased in a single campaign. They change, adapt, find new forms. Ironically, the destruction of IGA as an independent region contributed to the wider spread of shinobi expertise across Japan. Displaced specialists sought employment wherever opportunities existed. Military leaders eager for experienced intelligence operatives welcomed them. One such leader watched events very carefully. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Unlike Nobunaga, Ieyasu possessed a different style of leadership. He preferred patience over dramatic action. He rarely rushed into unnecessary risks. He understood that endurance could achieve what reckless aggression often could not. The future would prove him correct. Among the survivors connected with IGA traditions was a man whose name would eventually become inseparable from ninja history. Hattori Hanzo. Perhaps no historical figure has attracted more legend than Hanzo. Modern films, video games, comics, television dramas, almost all portray him as an almost supernatural warrior. The historical man was impressive enough without such exaggeration. Hattori Hanzo served Tokugawa Ieyasu with remarkable loyalty. He commanded men familiar with covert operations, mountain travel, reconnaissance, and irregular tactics. His reputation for reliability became one of his greatest strengths. Exactly which missions he personally carried out remains difficult to determine. Many stories appeared long after his death. Separating fact from legend requires caution. Still, historical evidence clearly shows that Ieyasu valued both Hanzo and the specialists associated with him. This relationship would later prove vital during one of the most dangerous moments of Ieyasu's life. Meanwhile, Nobunaga continued expanding his influence. Province after province submitted. Major rivals disappeared. His control stretched farther each year. Many observers believed complete unification now seemed inevitable. Yet history often changes direction with astonishing speed. No ruler, however powerful, could completely eliminate uncertainty. In the summer of 1582, Nobunaga traveled to Kyoto. His escort remained relatively small. He did not expect immediate danger. After years of victory, the greatest threats appeared already defeated. One of his trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, received orders to join another campaign. Instead, he made a decision that stunned Japan. Rather than obeying, he turned his army toward Kyoto. Marching rapidly, his soldiers surrounded the temple known as Hanno-ji. Inside rested Nobunaga, caught almost completely by surprise. The attack began before dawn. Flames spread quickly. The defenders fought desperately, but their numbers were far too small. Realizing escape had become impossible, Nobunaga chose death rather than capture. Exactly how his final moments unfolded remains uncertain. Some accounts describe ritual suicide. Others suggest he died fighting as the temple burned. The confusion of the attack prevented complete certainty. Even his remains were never conclusively identified. With his death, the most powerful man in Japan vanished almost overnight. The unification he had pursued remained unfinished. Immediately, a struggle for succession began. Powerful generals assessed the situation. Old alliances shifted once again. Among those moving fastest was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man whose own life story demonstrated just how dramatically the Sengoku period could overturn traditional expectations. Unlike many great military leaders before him, Hideyoshi had not been born into one of Japan's highest-ranking warrior families. His rise would become one of the most extraordinary political transformations in Japanese history. And under his leadership, the relationship between samurai and shinobi would enter an entirely new chapter. When news of Oda Nobunaga's death spread across Japan, it traveled with astonishing speed. Messengers rode through the countryside without stopping. Castles prepared for uncertainty. Allies questioned their future. Enemies sensed opportunity. For nearly 2 decades, Nobunaga had appeared almost unstoppable. Now, in a single morning, the balance of power had shifted once again. Many assumed the country would fall back into endless civil war. Instead, events unfolded with remarkable speed. Far to the west, one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals was in the middle of another campaign. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Unlike most of the great military leaders of his age, Hideyoshi's origins were humble. Exactly where he was born and the details of his early childhood remain uncertain, as is often the case with people who rose from relatively modest beginnings during the 16th century. Most historians agree that he did not come from one of Japan's great aristocratic warrior families. That fact alone made his later achievements extraordinary. The Japan of the Sengoku period could be brutal. But it also rewarded talent in ways earlier generations rarely had. Military skill, political intelligence, relentless determination. These qualities sometimes mattered more than ancestry. Hideyoshi understood people. He knew when to negotiate, when to threaten, when to reward, and when to strike. Those abilities made him indispensable to Nobunaga. Over the years, he proved himself not only as a battlefield commander, but also as an administrator capable of organizing enormous military campaigns. When word reached him that Nobunaga had been betrayed, Hideyoshi realized that every hour mattered. If he moved too slowly, rival generals would seize the initiative. If he acted decisively, he might inherit the political momentum Nobunaga had created. He immediately negotiated peace with the enemy he had been fighting. This decision surprised many. Instead of continuing a successful campaign, he ended it almost overnight. His soldiers then turned around and began one of the fastest military marches in Japanese history. They covered remarkable distances in only a few days. Discipline made this possible. Every soldier understood the urgency. Every officer kept the columns moving. The goal was simple: find Akechi Mitsuhide before he could consolidate power. The two forces met only 13 days after Nobunaga's death. The battle was brief compared with many campaigns of the period. Hideyoshi's army prevailed. Mitsuhide fled. During his escape, he was killed, most likely by local villagers or wandering soldiers. His rebellion had lasted less than 2 weeks. Yet those 2 weeks had permanently changed Japan. With Nobunaga gone and Mitsuhide defeated, the question remained: who would lead next? Several powerful generals believed they possessed legitimate claims. Negotiations quickly became political maneuvering. Meetings were held, promises exchanged, alliances reconsidered. Hideyoshi consistently demonstrated one advantage over many rivals. He understood that military victory alone would not secure lasting authority. Legitimacy mattered. He carefully presented himself not as a usurper, but as the man continuing Nobunaga's mission of national unification. Gradually, support gathered around him. Some rivals accepted his leadership. Others resisted. Those who opposed him often discovered that Hideyoshi combined patience with overwhelming force. Campaign by campaign, he expanded his influence. Castle after castle submitted. Some surrendered peacefully after negotiation. Others required lengthy sieges. By the end of the 1580s, only a few major powers remained outside his control. One by one, they too accepted defeat. For the first time in generations, Japan approached political unity. Yet Hideyoshi understood that military victory alone could not guarantee peace. If the country continued operating exactly as it had during the Sengoku period, another generation of ambitious warlords would eventually tear it apart again. He needed to reshape society itself. His reforms reached nearly every corner of Japan. One of the most significant was an enormous land survey. Officials traveled throughout the country measuring fields, recording harvests, identifying landowners, estimating agricultural production. To modernize, this may seem like routine government administration. In the 16th century, it represented an enormous undertaking. Reliable information allowed the government to calculate taxes more accurately. It also reduced opportunities for local officials to conceal wealth or exaggerate losses. Knowledge became another form of power. Hideyoshi also attempted to define social classes more clearly than they had been during the chaos of the previous century. Throughout the Sengoku period, many individuals had moved between occupations. Farmers sometimes became soldiers. Soldiers returned to farming. Merchants financed military campaigns. Society remained remarkably fluid compared with later generations. Hideyoshi believed that stability required clearer boundaries. One of his best-known policies became known as the sword hunt. Government officials collected weapons from people outside the warrior class. The stated purpose was to reduce the likelihood of future rebellions. Without easy access to swords and spears, large-scale uprisings became more difficult to organize. The policy also reinforced an emerging idea. Those who fought professionally should be distinct from those who farmed. The samurai gradually became a hereditary military class. This transformation would shape Japanese society for centuries. For the shinobi, these changes carried important consequences. Their traditional strength had often depended upon blending into ordinary communities. If governments increasingly recorded who lived where, who farmed which fields, and who legally carried weapons, moving unnoticed became more difficult. Hideyoshi did not abolish intelligence gathering. On the contrary, he continued using covert specialists whenever military necessity required them. But he also preferred a more orderly society where independent military groups possessed less freedom. Many shinobi entered permanent service under powerful lords. Others adapted to changing circumstances. The era of loosely organized regional networks slowly began giving way to something more centralized. Hideyoshi's relationship with covert operations remained practical. He valued useful information. During his campaigns against remaining rivals, scouts and intelligence agents continued playing important roles. Before besieging a castle, commanders still wanted maps, supply estimates, knowledge of hidden entrances. The difference was that these missions increasingly served a government attempting to end civil war rather than prolong it. One of the final great obstacles to national unity was the Hojo clan. Their territory dominated much of eastern Japan. Their capital, Odawara Castle, ranked among the strongest fortifications in the country. Capturing it through direct assault promised enormous casualties. Hideyoshi instead chose a strategy combining overwhelming military pressure with psychological warfare. His army surrounded the castle. The siege continued for months. Rather than launching reckless attacks, he patiently tightened control over the surrounding region. Entertainment performances reportedly took place within parts of the immense military camp. Markets operated. Supplies continued arriving. The message became clear. The besieging army intended to remain as long as necessary. Eventually, resistance collapsed. The Hojo surrendered. With that victory, nearly all of Japan recognized Hideyoshi's authority. The long era of fragmented rule had effectively come to an end. Peace, however, created unexpected problems. Generations of samurai had known almost nothing except war. Many had built their identities around military service. Countless retainers depended economically upon campaigns that no longer existed. A peaceful country required different forms of leadership. Administrators, tax officials, judges, engineers. The warrior class gradually found itself adapting to responsibilities beyond the battlefield. For the shinobi, the transition proved even more dramatic. Their greatest value had emerged during political uncertainty. Civil wars created endless opportunities for reconnaissance, sabotage, and covert communication. As Japan stabilized, demand for those services naturally declined. This did not mean they disappeared. Governments always require intelligence, but the scale changed. Instead of dozens of competing warlords hiring specialists simultaneously, authority increasingly concentrated under a single national leadership. Hideyoshi himself remained restless. Having unified Japan, he turned his attention beyond the islands. He dreamed of campaigns on the Asian mainland. His ambition extended toward Korea and ultimately China. In 1592, enormous Japanese forces crossed the sea and invaded Korea. Initially, the campaign advanced rapidly. Several major cities fell. Japanese commanders demonstrated considerable military effectiveness on land. Yet the invasion soon encountered serious difficulties. Korean naval forces under Admiral Isan repeatedly disrupted Japanese supply lines. Local resistance intensified. Chinese armies entered the conflict in support of Korea. The war expanded far beyond its original expectations. For years, fighting continued without producing decisive victory. Historical evidence suggests that intelligence specialists accompanied these campaigns. Scouting unfamiliar territory became essential. Maps had to be prepared, roads identified, enemy positions located. Yet mainland warfare differed greatly from campaigns inside Japan. The terrain was unfamiliar. Local languages created additional barriers. The advantages accumulated over generations within Japanese provinces no longer applied in the same way. Eventually, the invasion stalled. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, Japanese forces withdrew from Korea. His continental ambitions ended with him. Back in Japan, another question emerged. Who would govern now? Hideyoshi's chosen heir was still a child. To preserve stability, several of the country's most powerful lords formed a council intended to rule until the boy reached adulthood. Among those men stood Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, careful, experienced. He had survived decades of warfare. He had served Nobunaga, worked alongside Hideyoshi, learned from both. Unlike many rivals, he rarely acted from impulse. He preferred waiting until conditions favored success. The years ahead would test every lesson he had learned. Because although Japan had been unified, peace remained fragile. Within only 2 years of Hideyoshi's death, rival factions began preparing for another confrontation. It would become one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. A single day that would determine not only who ruled Japan, but also the future of the samurai, the shinobi, and the nation itself. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in the autumn of 1598, he left behind a country that was united in appearance, but uncertain beneath the surface. For decades, his authority had held together dozens of powerful regional lords. Many of those men had once fought against one another. Some had accepted his rule willingly. Others had submitted only because resistance seemed impossible. Now the man who had balanced those competing interests was gone. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was only a child. A child could inherit a title. He could not command the respect of battle-hardened daimyo who had spent their entire lives surviving one of history's most violent civil wars. To prevent immediate conflict, Hideyoshi had established a council of 5 regents. The idea appeared sensible. Several of Japan's most powerful lords would govern together until Hideyori became an adult. On paper, the arrangement promised stability. Reality proved much more complicated. Every member of the council possessed ambition. Every member controlled armies. Every member understood that whoever emerged from the coming political struggle would shape Japan for generations. Among them, one man possessed advantages that were not immediately obvious. Tokugawa Ieyasu, unlike Oda Nobunaga, who often moved with breathtaking speed, or Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose charisma won over allies almost effortlessly. Who would lead next? Several powerful generals believed they possessed legitimate claims. Negotiations quickly became political maneuvering. Meetings were held, promises exchanged, alliances reconsidered. Hideyoshi consistently demonstrated one advantage over many rivals. He understood that military victory alone would not secure lasting authority. Legitimacy mattered. He carefully presented himself not as a usurper, but as the man continuing Nobunaga's mission of national unification. Gradually, support gathered around him. Some rivals accepted his leadership. Others resisted. Those who opposed him often discovered that Hideyoshi combined patience with overwhelming force. Campaign by campaign, he expanded his influence. Castle after castle submitted. Some surrendered peacefully after negotiation. Others required lengthy sieges. By the end of the 1580s, only a few major powers remained outside his control. One by one, they too accepted defeat. For the first time in generations, Japan approached political unity. Yet Hideyoshi understood that military victory alone could not guarantee peace. If the country continued operating exactly as it had during the Sengoku period, another generation of ambitious warlords would eventually tear it apart again. He needed to reshape society itself. His reforms reached nearly every corner of Japan. One of the most significant was an enormous land survey. Officials traveled throughout the country measuring fields, recording harvests, identifying landowners, estimating agricultural production. To modernize, this may seem like routine government administration. In the 16th century, it represented an enormous undertaking. Reliable information allowed the government to calculate taxes more accurately. It also reduced opportunities for local officials to conceal wealth or exaggerate losses. Knowledge became another form of power. Hideyoshi also attempted to define social classes more clearly than they had been during the chaos of the previous century. Throughout the Sengoku period, many individuals had moved between occupations. Farmers sometimes became soldiers. Soldiers returned to farming. Merchants financed military campaigns. Society remained remarkably fluid compared with later generations. Hideyoshi believed that stability required clearer boundaries. One of his best-known policies became known as the sword hunt. Government officials collected weapons from people outside the warrior class. The stated purpose was to reduce the likelihood of future rebellions. Without easy access to swords and spears, large-scale uprisings became more difficult to organize. The policy also reinforced an emerging idea. Those who fought professionally should be distinct from those who farmed. The samurai gradually became a hereditary military class. This transformation would shape Japanese society for centuries. For the shinobi, these changes carried important consequences. Their traditional strength had often depended upon blending into ordinary communities. If governments increasingly recorded who lived where, who farmed which fields, and who legally carried weapons, moving unnoticed became more difficult. Hideyoshi did not abolish intelligence gathering. On the contrary, he continued using covert specialists whenever military necessity required them. But he also preferred a more orderly society where independent military groups possessed less freedom. Many shinobi entered permanent service under powerful lords. Others adapted to changing circumstances. The era of loosely organized regional networks slowly began giving way to something more centralized. Hideyoshi's relationship with covert operations remained practical. He valued useful information. During his campaigns against remaining rivals, scouts and intelligence agents continued playing important roles. Before besieging a castle, commanders still wanted maps, supply estimates, knowledge of hidden entrances. The difference was that these missions increasingly served a government attempting to end civil war rather than prolong it. One of the final great obstacles to national unity was the Hojo clan. Their territory dominated much of eastern Japan. Their capital, Odawara Castle, ranked among the strongest fortifications in the country. Capturing it through direct assault promised enormous casualties. Hideyoshi instead chose a strategy combining overwhelming military pressure with psychological warfare. His army surrounded the castle. The siege continued for months. Rather than launching reckless attacks, he patiently tightened control over the surrounding region. Entertainment performances reportedly took place within parts of the immense military camp. Markets operated. Supplies continued arriving. The message became clear. The besieging army intended to remain as long as necessary. Eventually, resistance collapsed. The Hojo surrendered. With that victory, nearly all of Japan recognized Hideyoshi's authority. The long era of fragmented rule had effectively come to an end. Peace, however, created unexpected problems. Generations of samurai had known almost nothing except war. Many had built their identities around military service. Countless retainers depended economically upon campaigns that no longer existed. A peaceful country required different forms of leadership. Administrators, tax officials, judges, engineers. The warrior class gradually found itself adapting to responsibilities beyond the battlefield. For the shinobi, the transition proved even more dramatic. Their greatest value had emerged during political uncertainty. Civil wars created endless opportunities for reconnaissance, sabotage, and covert communication. As Japan stabilized, demand for those services naturally declined. This did not mean they disappeared. Governments always require intelligence. But the scale changed. Instead of dozens of competing warlords hiring specialists simultaneously, authority increasingly concentrated under a single national leadership. Hideyoshi himself remained restless. Having unified Japan, he turned his attention beyond the islands. He dreamed of campaigns on the Asian mainland. His ambition extended toward Korea and ultimately China. In 1592, enormous Japanese forces crossed the sea and invaded Korea. Initially, the campaign advanced rapidly. Several major cities fell. Japanese commanders demonstrated considerable military effectiveness on land. Yet the invasion soon encountered serious difficulties. Korean naval forces under Admiral Isan repeatedly disrupted Japanese supply lines. Local resistance intensified. Chinese armies entered the conflict in support of Korea. The war expanded far beyond its original expectations. For years, fighting continued without producing decisive victory. Historical evidence suggests that intelligence specialists accompanied these campaigns. Scouting unfamiliar territory became essential. Maps had to be prepared, roads identified, enemy positions located. Yet mainland warfare differed greatly from campaigns inside Japan. The terrain was unfamiliar. Local languages created additional barriers. The advantages accumulated over generations within Japanese provinces no longer applied in the same way. Eventually, the invasion stalled. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, Japanese forces withdrew from Korea. His continental ambitions ended with him. Back in Japan, another question emerged. Who would govern now? Hideyoshi's chosen heir was still a child. To preserve stability, several of the country's most powerful lords formed a council intended to rule until the boy reached adulthood. Among those men stood Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, careful, experienced. He had survived decades of warfare. He had served Nobunaga, worked alongside Hideyoshi, learned from both. Unlike many rivals, he rarely acted from impulse. He preferred waiting until conditions favored success. The years ahead would test every lesson he had learned. Because although Japan had been unified, peace remained fragile. Within only 2 years of Hideyoshi's death, rival factions began preparing for another confrontation. It would become one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. A single day that would determine not only who ruled Japan, but also the future of the samurai, the shinobi, and the nation itself. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in the autumn of 1598, he left behind a country that was united in appearance, but uncertain beneath the surface. For decades, his authority had held together dozens of powerful regional lords. Many of those men had once fought against one another. Some had accepted his rule willingly. Others had submitted only because resistance seemed impossible. Now the man who had balanced those competing interests was gone. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was only a child. A child could inherit a title. He could not command the respect of battle-hardened daimyo who had spent their entire lives surviving one of history's most violent civil wars. To prevent immediate conflict, Hideyoshi had established a council of 5 regents. The idea appeared sensible. Several of Japan's most powerful lords would govern together until Hideyoshi became an adult. On paper, the arrangement promised stability. Reality proved much more complicated. Every member of the council possessed ambition. Every member controlled armies. Every member understood that whoever emerged from the coming political struggle would shape Japan for generations. Among them, one man possessed advantages that were not immediately obvious. Tokugawa Ieyasu, unlike Oda and Nobunaga, who often moved with breathtaking speed, or Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose charisma won over allies almost effortlessly. Ieyasu relied on patience. He understood the value of waiting. Throughout his life, he had endured setbacks that might have destroyed other leaders. As a child, he had been sent away as a political hostage. During his youth, he had lived under the authority of stronger lords. He had learned that survival sometimes required accepting temporary weakness while preparing quietly for future opportunity. Those experiences shaped his entire approach to leadership. He rarely acted out of anger. He rarely rushed into unnecessary conflict. When others exhausted themselves through impulsive decisions, Ieyasu observed. Calculated. Prepared. That patience would soon be tested. As the months passed after Hideyoshi's death, distrust spread through the ruling council. Political disagreements became personal rivalries. Letters circulated between different domains. Old alliances resurfaced. New promises were made behind closed doors. The country had not yet returned to open war, but everyone could feel it approaching. The principal opponent to Ieyasu emerged in the form of Ishida Mitsunari. Mitsunari had served Hideyoshi faithfully for many years. He was intelligent, highly educated, an able administrator. Yet, unlike many great military commanders, his reputation rested more upon organization than battlefield leadership. He believed that preserving the Toyotomi family represented the legitimate path forward. Ieyasu, in contrast, increasingly appeared willing to establish his own authority. Each side accused the other of threatening national stability. Both claimed to defend the proper political order. Neither intended to surrender. Throughout Japan, daimyo faced difficult decisions. Should they support the Toyotomi heir, or should they align themselves with the increasingly powerful Tokugawa leader? For many, the choice involved more than loyalty. It involved survival. Choosing the losing side could cost an entire family everything. Land, titles, status, sometimes even life itself. By the year 1600, the divisions had become impossible to hide. Japan once again prepared for war. The opposing coalitions gathered soldiers from across the country. Some clans remained loyal to Mitsunari. Others declared for Ieyasu. Still others hesitated until the last possible moment, hoping events would reveal which side offered the greater chance of survival. The campaign moved rapidly. Armies crossed provinces. Castles changed hands. Messengers traveled day and night carrying urgent reports. Intelligence once again became priceless. Every commander needed accurate information. Where was the enemy advancing? How many soldiers accompanied them? Which roads remained open? Which allies could still be trusted? In moments like these, experienced scouts and covert operatives became as valuable as entire companies of infantry. One episode from this period illustrates the practical importance of the IGA shinobi far better than any fictional tale of impossible acrobatics. As Ieyasu maneuvered across central Japan, his position remained dangerous. Large enemy forces threatened not only the front of his advancing army, but also the territories behind him. Communication became increasingly difficult. Roads were watched. Messengers risked capture. If vital orders failed to reach loyal commanders, entire defensive plans might collapse. According to historical accounts preserved by later Tokugawa records, men associated with Hattori Hanzo's network helped carry messages through hostile territory. Their knowledge of hidden routes, mountain paths, and methods of avoiding enemy patrols proved invaluable. Unlike the dramatic assassinations of popular culture, these missions involved something less glamorous but infinitely more important: delivering information. A single successful message could prevent disaster. An intercepted letter could destroy an entire campaign. Military history often celebrates great battles. Yet wars are frequently decided by quieter moments. A bridge repaired in time. A food convoy arriving safely. A messenger avoiding capture. An accurate report reaching the right commander. These invisible achievements rarely become legends. But without them, victories often become impossible. As October approached, the two great armies finally converged. Their meeting place lay near a crossroads surrounded by hills and low mountains. The village was called Sekigahara. Morning arrived beneath thick fog. Visibility remained poor. Thousands of soldiers waited in tense silence. They could hear movement. They could hear distant voices. But often they could not clearly see the opposing army. The uncertainty increased everyone's anxiety. Historians estimate that roughly 150,000 men participated in the battle altogether. For its time, it was one of the largest military confrontations in Japanese history. Rows of Shigeru infantry stood carrying long spears. Companies of musketeers prepared their weapons. Mounted samurai waited for orders. Commanders studied the surrounding hills where Allied forces occupied strategic positions. The battle began gradually. As the fog lifted, exchanges of gunfire echoed across the valley. Archers joined the fighting. Spearmen advanced. Cavalry searched for openings. For hours, neither side gained a decisive advantage. Then attention shifted toward the surrounding heights. Several important daimyo had positioned their forces on elevated ground. Among them stood Kobayakawa Hideaki. Officially, he belonged to the Western Army supporting Mitsunari. Privately, his loyalties remained uncertain. Ieyasu had spent weeks attempting to persuade him to change sides. Whether through promises of future rewards, political calculation, or personal ambition, Kobayakawa hesitated while the battle raged below. Historical sources differ on exactly what happened next. Some claim Ieyasu ordered musketeers to fire toward Kobayakawa's position as a warning. Others suggest negotiations had already secured his support before the battle began. Whatever the precise sequence, one fact is clear. Kobayakawa eventually committed his troops against his own allies. The sudden attack shattered the cohesion of the Western Army. Confusion spread rapidly. Other commanders who had secretly considered changing sides now followed his example. Units that had fought together moments earlier suddenly found enemies appearing from unexpected directions. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Mitsunari's army collapsed. Many soldiers attempted to retreat. Others fought until surrounded. By evening, the outcome could no longer be questioned. Tokugawa Ieyasu had achieved the greatest victory of his career. The Battle of Sekigahara lasted only a single day. Its consequences shaped the next 2.5 centuries of Japanese history. Victory on the battlefield represented only the beginning. Ieyasu immediately moved to consolidate power. Supporters received generous rewards. Lands were redistributed. Families that had opposed him often lost their domains. Political authority gradually concentrated in Tokugawa hands. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor formally appointed Ieyasu as shogun. The title carried immense significance. Although the emperor remained the symbolic head of the nation, practical government now rested firmly with the Tokugawa military administration. A new era had begun. Its capital would be Edo, the city known today as Tokyo. For the IGA shinobi who had served Ieyasu faithfully, the victory brought important changes. Many received official positions within the new government. Some settled permanently near Edo Castle. Their descendants became hereditary retainers of the Tokugawa household. One of the castle gates eventually became known as Hanzomon, the Gate of Hanzo. Even today, modern Tokyo still preserves that name. It stands as one of the few visible reminders connecting the present city to the historical world of the IGA warriors. Yet hidden beneath this apparent success lay a quiet irony. The shinobi had helped create a government powerful enough to eliminate the conditions that had once made their profession indispensable. Japan was no longer divided among dozens of competing warlords. There would be no endless cycle of rival armies requiring constant espionage. No independent mountain provinces resisting central authority. No shifting alliances demanding covert negotiation every season. Peace, the very goal that generations of leaders had pursued, would slowly transform the role of both samurai and shinobi. The age of survival through constant warfare was ending. An age of order was about to begin, and with it, both of Japan's most famous warrior traditions would face a challenge unlike any battlefield they had ever known. By the time Tokugawa Ieyasu secured control of Japan, the country had endured more than a century of nearly continuous warfare. Entire generations had grown up knowing little else. Children learned to recognize the sound of marching armies before they learned to read. Farmers planted crops, never knowing whether soldiers would harvest them instead. Castles dominated the landscape. Every province expected conflict. Every lord prepared for the next campaign. Now, almost overnight by historical standards, that reality began to disappear. It would not happen in a single year, nor even in a single decade, but the direction was unmistakable. The Tokugawa government intended to prevent another age of civil war. To accomplish that goal, it introduced one of the most carefully organized political systems in Japanese history. Power would no longer be allowed to drift freely between ambitious military families. Every major lord would remain under constant observation. Every domain would have clearly defined responsibilities. Every potential source of rebellion would be monitored before it could become dangerous. The new government understood a lesson earned through generations of bloodshed. Winning a war was difficult. Preventing the next one required something even greater. Administration, control, information. The city of Edo became the center of this new political order. When Ieyasu first chose it as his base, it was far smaller than Kyoto. Within a few generations, it would become one of the largest cities in the world. Roads expanded outward from the capital. Merchants arrived. Craftsmen settled there. Government offices multiplied. Thousands of samurai families relocated to serve the new administration. The country that had once revolved around military campaigns increasingly revolved around bureaucracy. One of the Tokugawa government's most important policies became known as Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance. Under this system, each daimyo was required to spend part of every year in Edo. His family usually remained there permanently. In effect, the families of powerful regional lords lived under the watchful eyes of the shogunate. The arrangement served several purposes at once. Traveling with enormous entourages consumed tremendous resources. Maintaining residences both in Edo and in home provinces proved extremely expensive. As a result, regional lords possessed less money to finance rebellions. Meanwhile, their frequent presence in the capital allowed the government to observe their behavior closely. If discontent began growing, officials often noticed early. The system relied less upon open force than careful management. This represented a profound shift in the nature of political power. For the samurai, the consequences were equally profound. For centuries, their identity had rested upon warfare. Many had spent their entire lives preparing for battles that might occur at any moment. Now, battles almost disappeared. What role remained for a professional warrior during an age of peace? The answer developed gradually. The samurai became administrators, government officials, judges, tax collectors, teachers, advisors. Their swords remained symbols of status. But increasingly, they spent more time writing reports than drawing blades. This transformation was not always easy. Some adapted enthusiastically. Education had always formed part of elite warrior culture. Many samurai already possessed strong literary skills. Administrative work suited them well. Others struggled. Their fathers and grandfathers had earned honor on battlefields. Now, they sat behind desks reviewing land records and tax documents. The contrast felt enormous. Martial training continued. Swordsmanship schools flourished. Archery remained respected. Spears were still practiced. But these arts gradually became less about preparing for imminent war and more about preserving discipline, character, and tradition. Combat evolved into a path of personal development. The philosophy surrounding the samurai also changed. Many people today imagine Bushido as an ancient code that guided every medieval warrior from the beginning of Japanese history. The historical reality is more complicated. Ideas about loyalty, courage, and honor certainly existed for centuries. However, many of the books that most strongly shaped modern ideas about Bushido were actually written during the long peace of the Tokugawa period. This is one of history's fascinating ironies. The ideal image of the perfect warrior became more fully developed after major wars had largely ended. Writers reflected upon the past. They attempted to define what a samurai should represent. Works such as the Hagakure emphasize complete loyalty, calm acceptance of death, self-discipline, and moral responsibility. These texts did not necessarily describe how every warrior had behaved during the chaos of the Sengoku period. Instead, they presented ideals, standards toward which samurai were encouraged to strive. Reality, of course, remained more complex. Like every human society, Japan contained brave individuals, cowards, loyal servants, ambitious opportunists, compassionate leaders, cruel commanders. No code could erase the diversity of human nature. Yet these ideals shaped generations of education. Young samurai grew up studying ethics alongside martial arts. Honor became as important as skill. Character became as important as courage. Meanwhile, the shinobi faced an even greater transformation. Their traditional profession had depended upon instability. Competing warlords constantly sought information. Every border concealed potential enemies. Every campaign created opportunities for covert operations. Peace removed many of those opportunities. That did not mean intelligence gathering disappeared. Far from it. Governments always require information. The Tokugawa administration understood this perfectly. Instead of employing covert specialists against rival daimyo during civil wars, the government now used them to maintain domestic stability. Historical records describe groups associated with the shogunate who observed potentially troublesome domains, investigated suspicious activity, collected reports from distant provinces, monitored rumors, tracked religious movements considered politically dangerous. One organization often associated with these responsibilities became known as the Onawabin, literally, the Garden Keepers. The title sounded harmless. Its duties were considerably more significant. These officials served as trusted investigators and intelligence agents for the Tokugawa government. Popular fiction sometimes portrays the Onawabin as armies of masked assassins moving silently across rooftops. The historical reality appears more restrained. Their work resembled intelligence and security operations more than dramatic combat missions. Observation, verification, reporting, discretion. Success depended upon accuracy. A false report could damage innocent families. An overlooked threat could endanger national stability. Some descendants of Iga and Koka traditions entered this official service. Others accepted positions within regional governments. Still others gradually left military life altogether. The skills they possessed remained valuable, but the demand for them steadily declined. Many families adapted by becoming merchants, doctors, craftsmen, teachers. The profession slowly dissolved into ordinary society. Its knowledge survived. Its social identity weakened. This period also witnessed another important development: the recording of shinobi knowledge. For generations, many techniques had passed from teacher to student through direct instruction. Now, during an age when opportunities to use those skills had become less frequent, several detailed manuals were compiled. Among the most famous was the Bansen Shuki, completed in the 17th century. Far from describing magical powers or supernatural abilities, it focused on practical matters: observation, disguise, navigation, psychology, weather, medicine, fire, signals, planning, patience. Reading the manual today reveals something striking. Historical shinobi appear less like fictional assassins and more like highly trained intelligence professionals. Again and again, the text emphasizes preparation over violence. A successful mission avoided unnecessary combat. The ideal operative returned with information, not with glory. Another manual, the Shininki, explored similar themes. It stressed emotional control, adaptability, calm judgment under pressure. The greatest danger during covert work often came not from enemies, but from panic. A frightened mind made mistakes. A disciplined mind noticed opportunities. These writings reveal an intellectual tradition rarely acknowledged by popular culture. The historical shinobi relied upon careful observation more than extraordinary athletic feats. The longer peace continued, the more these manuals served another purpose: preservation. Their authors understood that they belonged to the final generations who possessed direct experience of the old age of warfare. Future readers might never infiltrate an enemy castle. They might never carry messages through hostile territory, but they could still learn the principles. The knowledge deserved to survive, even if the profession itself gradually disappeared. Outside Japan, dramatic changes were beginning to reshape the wider world. European ships crossed oceans with increasing frequency. International trade expanded. Firearms improved. Scientific knowledge accelerated. Japan, however, increasingly chose isolation. The Tokugawa government tightly regulated foreign contact. Only limited trade continued through carefully controlled ports. Officials believed restricting outside influence would preserve domestic stability. For more than 2 centuries, that policy largely succeeded. Japan experienced remarkable internal peace. Cities grew, agriculture improved, commerce flourished, population increased. Art and literature entered periods of extraordinary creativity. Kabuki theater developed. Woodblock printing expanded. Poetry reached new audiences. The peaceful society that emerged during the Tokugawa era became one of the most stable in early modern history. Its stability always carries hidden consequences. Generation after generation passed without major wars. Weapons remained carefully maintained. Armor remained displayed. Martial arts remained practiced. But increasingly, they became traditions remembered rather than necessities experienced. Young samurai studied battlefield tactics from books rather than first-hand experience. Stories replaced memory. Memory slowly became legend, and legend began transforming both the samurai and the shinobi into figures larger than life. The real warriors who had once walked muddy roads and endured freezing nights beneath open skies gradually gave way to something else. Symbols, heroes, mysterious shadows. The foundations of the myths that still shape our understanding today were quietly being laid during the longest peace Japan had ever known. One of the great ironies of Japanese history is that the images most people recognize today did not fully develop during the Great Age of War. They developed after the wars had ended. When people are fighting to survive, they rarely have time to create legends. They focus on food, shelter, weapons, family. Tomorrow is often only after peace arrives that societies begin looking backward. They remember, they simplify, they celebrate. Sometimes they exaggerate. The Tokugawa period lasted for more than 250 years. That is an extraordinary length of time. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen in shorter periods. Generation followed generation. Children heard stories from grandparents who had heard stories from warriors who had actually fought during the Sengoku era. Each retelling changed small details. A clever ambush became an impossible escape. A dangerous climb became a leap across rooftops. An experienced scout became a mysterious shadow, capable of appearing and disappearing at will. That is how legends are often born, not through deliberate lies, but through countless small additions made over centuries. The same process affected the samurai. The men who had lived through the civil wars were often practical. They understood hunger, disease, fear. They knew that battles were rarely glorious. Victory usually belonged to whichever army remained organized after days or weeks of exhaustion. Later generations remembered something different. They remembered courage, loyalty, honor, heroic last stands, dramatic duels. These things certainly existed, but they became the center of the story. The confusion, the mistakes, the compromises, those gradually faded into the background. During the Edo period, literacy expanded. Books became more accessible. Woodblock printing allowed stories to reach audiences that earlier centuries could never have imagined. Travel also became easier inside Japan. Pilgrims moved between famous shrines. Merchants carried goods from province to province. Along with silk, rice, fea, and paper, they carried stories. One village might preserve an account of a famous samurai. Another might tell tales of mysterious men from Aegean who could enter a castle without leaving footprints. By the time these stories reached distant regions, they had often become something entirely new. The theater played an enormous role in shaping public imagination. Kabuki became one of Japan's most popular forms of entertainment. Its actors performed before enthusiastic audiences eager for excitement. Historical accuracy was not always the highest priority. Entertainment came first. Playwrights understood that mystery attracted attention. So did impossible feats. A warrior who fought bravely was impressive. A warrior who vanished into darkness before the audience's eyes was unforgettable. The famous image of the ninja, dressed completely in black, owes much to this theatrical tradition. On the kabuki stage, stagehands often wore plain black clothing. Audiences understood that these workers were not part of the performance. Their purpose was to move scenery or assist actors while remaining almost invisible. Playwrights eventually realized they could use this convention creatively. A character dressed like a stagehand could suddenly reveal himself as a hidden assassin or spy. The surprise delighted audiences. Over time, people began associating that costume with historical ninja. In reality, a person attempting to move unnoticed would have preferred clothing appropriate to the environment. A merchant should look like a merchant. A monk should resemble a monk. A farmer should blend among farmers. Standing out invited suspicion. Historical shinobi generally avoided attracting attention whenever possible. Yet the theatrical image proved unforgettable. Centuries later, films and comic books would adopt it. Then television. Then video games. Today, millions of people imagine historical ninja dressed entirely in black. The irony is remarkable. One of the world's most famous historical images originated largely from stage production rather than battlefield reality. The same transformation occurred with weapons. Take the shuriken. Popular culture often presents it as the defining weapon of every ninja. Characters throw dozens of them with perfect accuracy. Enemies collapse instantly. Historical evidence paints a far less dramatic picture. Shuriken certainly existed. Different forms were used. Some resembled pointed spikes. Others looked more like flat metal blades. Yet surviving manuals rarely describe them as primary killing weapons. Instead, they serve practical purposes, creating distraction, interrupting pursuit, forcing hesitation. A single moment of confusion might allow an operative to escape. Escape remained the highest priority. A successful mission required survival, not theatrical combat. The straight ninja, sword familiar for modern entertainment, presents another interesting example. Historians continue debating exactly what weapons historical shinobi carried. There is little evidence that one unique sword design universally identified them. Many likely carried ordinary Japanese swords because ordinary weapons attracted less attention. Again, practicality mattered far more than symbolism. Popular culture, however, prefers visual identity. Distinctive weapons help audiences recognize characters immediately. History rarely works that way. The samurai experienced similar myth-making. The katana gradually became almost sacred within Japanese culture. Master swordsmiths certainly produced extraordinary blades. Many survive today as priceless cultural treasures. Yet historical samurai relied upon many different weapons depending upon circumstance. On medieval battlefields, spears often proved more important than swords. Bows remained essential for centuries. Later, firearms transformed military tactics. The sword never disappeared, but it was one weapon among many. Modern imagination often reverses that relationship. The katana becomes everything. The battlefield becomes a stage for individual duels. Reality was usually far more chaotic. Another enduring myth concerns Bushido. Many people believe every samurai followed one unchanging code from the earliest days of Japanese history. Historical evidence suggests something much more gradual. Ideas about loyalty, duty, courage, self-control, respect. These evolved over centuries. Different clans emphasized different traditions. Only during the long peace of the Edo period did writers begin organizing these values into more systematic philosophical works. That does not make Bushido unimportant. Quite the opposite. It became enormously influential. But understanding when and how these ideas developed allows us to appreciate history more accurately. The historical samurai did not all think identically. Just as soldiers from different countries today possess diverse personalities and beliefs, so did warriors in medieval Japan. Some were compassionate, others were ruthless. Some remained fiercely loyal throughout their lives. Others changed sides when circumstances demanded. The Sengoku period itself rewarded flexibility almost as often as unwavering loyalty. Reality resisted simple moral categories. As peace continued, martial arts themselves also changed. Training no longer prepared students for battles expected next month. Instead, it increasingly emphasized personal discipline, character, precision, self-improvement. Sword schools refined techniques through generations of careful instruction. Archery became connected with spiritual focus as much as military necessity. The tea ceremony found enthusiastic supporters among the warrior class. At first glance, serving tea appears unrelated to combat. Yet practitioners believed the ceremony cultivated patience, awareness, respect, control over one's emotions. Many samurai considered these qualities essential for leadership. Zen Buddhism continued influencing warrior culture as well. Meditation encouraged calm observation, acceptance of uncertainty, freedom from unnecessary fear. Again, these practices evolved during peace as much as war. The warrior gradually became not only a fighter, but also an ideal of disciplined living. The shinobi, meanwhile, slowly faded from public life. Many descendants of historical IGA and Koka families entered ordinary occupations. Some served local governments. Others became merchants, doctors, craftsmen, farmers. The knowledge remained within families, but opportunities to apply it professionally became increasingly rare. Ironically, the fewer genuine shinobi remained, the more mysterious they became in public imagination. Very few people personally knew anyone connected with historical covert traditions. That absence encouraged speculation. Rumors filled the empty spaces left by disappearing experience. Could they walk silently across rooftops? Could they remain underwater for impossible lengths of time? Did they possess secret medicines, hidden weapons, supernatural powers? The less people actually knew, the easier extraordinary stories became to believe. This pattern appears throughout history. When direct memory fades, imagination expands. By the 18th century, storytellers had begun creating fictional ninja whose abilities bore little resemblance to historical reality. Some transformed into animals. Others disappeared in clouds of smoke. Some became masters of invisible magic. Audiences loved these tales. They were never intended as accurate history. They were entertainment. Yet entertainment often outlives fact. Even today, many misconceptions about historical ninja trace their origins not to medieval documents, but to popular stories created centuries later. Despite this growing mythology, genuine historical documents survived. Manuals such as the Bansen Shuki and the Shininki preserved practical knowledge. Government records documented military campaigns. Family archives remained hidden within old households. Temple records quietly preserved local history. These sources remind us that behind every legend stood real human beings. People who became tired, who made mistakes, who worried about their families, who endured cold winters, who marched through mud, who feared death as any person would. Perhaps that reality is even more remarkable than the myths. because they accomplished extraordinary things without supernatural powers. They relied upon preparation, discipline, observation, experience, and patience, qualities far less dramatic than magic, yet infinitely more believable. For more than 2 centuries, this peaceful world remained remarkably stable. Few living in Japan could imagine how quickly everything would change once the outside world forced the country to confront a new age. The age of castles, samurai governments, and hereditary warrior rule was approaching its greatest challenge. Not from rival daimyo, not from hidden shinobi, but from distant nations arriving across the sea with technologies and ambitions unlike anything Japan had faced before. For more than 250 years, the Tokugawa government had achieved something that earlier generations would have considered almost impossible. Japan remained largely at peace. There were local disputes, political disagreements, natural disasters, periods of hardship, but the great civil wars that had once consumed the country had become memories rather than daily realities. Generations were born without ever witnessing the massive battles that had defined the Sengoku period. Children grew into adults hearing stories of famous warriors rather than becoming warriors themselves. The world had changed, yet while Japan remained relatively isolated, the rest of the world continued changing at an astonishing pace. Across Europe and North America, the Industrial Revolution transformed production, transportation, and warfare. Steam engines replaced older forms of power. Factories expanded. Railways crossed continents. Navies built iron warships powered by machines rather than wind. Firearms became faster, more accurate, and more reliable with every passing decade. These developments did not stop at national borders. Eventually, they reached Japan. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry entered Edo Bay with a squadron of steam-powered warships. To many